Welcome to Technovation. I'm your host, Peter High. Our broadcast today comes from our most recent Metis Strategy Digital Symposium. The topic we covered was cultivating an enterprise mindset, and the panelists who spoke about it were Michelle Greene, the Chief Information Officer, Global Technology and Business Services of Cardinal Health, and Marco Argenti, the Chief Information Officer of Goldman Sachs. The gentleman who led the conversation was Metis Strategy co-head of Executive Networks, Research and Media, Stephen Norton, who joins me now. Stephen, welcome.
Hey, Peter, thanks for having me. Great to see you as always.
Well, Stephen, I noted the topic a moment ago, cultivating an enterprise mindset. Talk a bit about why that was an important topic for us to cover from your perspective, as well as why Michelle and Marco were well suited to talk about it.
We find that exceptional technology leaders are actively breaking down organizational silos and finding more effective ways to drive major change initiatives. They're updating their operating models, embracing new team structures, and really taking a horizontal view across the organization to answer a question that I think everyone can really get behind, which is how do we deliver better experiences for customers? And so it was great to speak with Michelle and Marco, two truly standout leaders, about how they're adopting that enterprise mindset, not only in themselves, but also how they're evolving their company culture and really instilling that mindset and those behaviors in others. Marco is making big moves to transform his engineering organization at Goldman. He talks about this concept of an engineer 2.0. These people who are not only great coders, but also know how to bring the business lens into everything that they do. And I really appreciated the conversation with him. He brought some great insights into how teams can both figuratively and sometimes quite literally put themselves next to customers and build solutions that help them solve real problems. And then Michelle articulates the enterprise mindset so well. She starts off talking about how CIOs are business people who just happen to work in technology. And she has so many insights on how to strengthen alignment, both with teams, C-suite peers, the board, and many others, and how enterprise-wide digital fluency initiatives are bringing more voices to the table and really bringing more people along on the transformation journey. And so to me, both Michelle and Marco are great examples of leaders who are kind of turning the tables on this traditional business versus IT dynamic. At Goldman and Cardinal Health, it's increasingly harder to tell who's business and who's IT. And I think both of their stories really underscore the evolution of the CIO from tech leader to real enterprise change agent.
Well, thanks for that overview, Stephen. Let's get right into the conversation. Cultivating an enterprise mindset with Michelle Greene of Cardinal Health, Marco Argenti of Goldman Sachs, in conversation with Metis Strategy's own Stephen Norton.
So I'd love to introduce Marco Argenti. He's the CIO at Goldman Sachs, global investment bank and financial services organization with roughly $60 billion in annual revenue, and an organization that has traditionally been quite known for being forward-thinking when it comes to technology and innovation. He leads the engineering organization at Goldman, more than 12,000 developers, engineers, and others around the world. He also sits on Goldman's management committee, the technology risk committee, and a number of others. And prior to joining Goldman, he spent 6 years as VP of technology for Amazon Web Services. So played a big role in product development for the cloud services that I would bet a lot of people on this call are very familiar with today. Welcome, Marco.
Thank you. Thanks, Stephen.
And then our other panelist today is Michelle Greene. She's the EVP, Chief Information Officer for Global Technology and Business Services at Cardinal Health, a Fortune 15 healthcare services company with more than $180 billion in revenue. In her role, she oversees enterprise IT, Fuse, which is the company's commercial technology engine, global business services, and a lot more, which we'll get into shortly. She joined the company in 2021 as SVP of IT for the company's pharmaceutical segment, and then took over the CIO role in August of last year. And before joining Cardinal Health, she was the VP of IT at Masco Corporation and has held a number of roles at Johnson Controls, Sony Ericsson, and others. Michelle, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And so, Michelle, I thought that we would start with you. When we were doing some prep for this, you mentioned that last year, Cardinal Health did quite a large reorg that was focused on driving some of this real enterprise alignment. Could you walk us through a little bit of what that reorg looked like and some of the changes that you're starting to see?
We had the opportunity to do a reorg, and I'm really big on not doing change for change's sake. But right then I had some pieces move that made it an opportune time to make some adjustments. I think the biggest thing we had also spoken about, Stephen, was around enterprise thinking, making sure that I lined up my organization with focus, of course, on our segments, because anyone is familiar with Cardinal knows we have a pharmaceutical segment, a medical segment, and our corporate offices. So in looking at that, we wanted to make sure that there was responsibility across all, that we're putting the right level of energy and focus. Our CEO is infamously known for saying, focus on the core. So we're trying to make sure we're doing the things that make sense and that are right now for our business. So that was my main driver behind my organizational changes, is making sure we have the right people doing the right roles, but also making sure that we take the opportunity to emphasize enterprise thinking across the organization.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And Marco, could you talk a little bit about, across your group of 12,000 plus folks, how you drive some of that enterprise thinking among the engineering teams?
Yeah, so that's really like ultimately a change in the role of engineers, in the 21st century, meaning that you kind of go from the back office to just straight to close to the customer. And I think the biggest, cultural shift is when engineers are really thinking about the why of what they're building, really putting themselves in the shoe of developers. So I don't think today an engineer, to be true to their profession, can be purely technical. They need to be somehow a mix of technical and product management, but most importantly, really understand the customers and really understand what the customers want. Because today in a world where business and technology are really interchanged, sometimes it's hard to tell where the line is, especially when it comes to things like data science, or when it comes to things like alpha generation, or when it comes to things about that are of strategic nature. Many companies are strategically enabled or limited by their technology capabilities. It's pretty clear in a digital world. And so how can you be an engineer without understanding your customer? And so within the organization, one of the big changes that we've made was to really start the development process of any solution working backwards from the customer. So having engineers asking themselves 5 questions, which is, first of all, who's your customer? What is it that you're really trying to solve there for them? Is that a big opportunity, or is that a big blocker? And then how do you know that that is actually an opportunity or a blocker? How do you measure that? How's the user experience? Those are the first questions. You're kind of shifting left on the consumer and the purpose of the solution, and not the other way around, which is being traditional in IT, which is, we actually have a piece of technology and now we're going to go around and shop for use cases. That's completely the other way around. So at the beginning of every project, we start with the working backwards documents that engineers put together. It's a narrative that explains the solution from the view of a customer. And I have to say, customers here is defined as anyone that actually is consuming a service, internal or external. So there are plenty of internal customers. Well, those internal customers are the most important ones. And I think for us, that has been the number one way that we really drive this enterprise customer-centric mentality in our developers.
And Marco, I will have to say, first of all, I guess either I can come work for you or you can come work for me, because we're on the exact same page. One thing I
I'd be happy to work for you.
I tell my team all the time, we are business people that happen to work in technology.
That's right.
And that's because we need to have the right mindset, because without understanding business, and I would argue without having business people that understand technology, we will not continue to win the battle, whether it's coming to technology, talent, or even when we're looking to try to put in great solutions and innovate within the company.
Yeah, absolutely.
100%. And I really appreciate the way that you've kind of described the customer or the patient or the end user as that key unifier across all of these teams, and being able to take that extra step of saying we're going to document putting ourselves in the shoes of those people so we really do understand that journey is tremendous. As you both know, obviously there's a lot of work in influencing your teams and teams across the organization in kind of developing that enterprise mindset and growing that muscle, but there's also a lot of kind of day-to-day work with the leadership team and thinking about your peers in the organization and other leaders across the company as you try to drive that. Michelle, I'm curious to hear about how you work with leaders in your organization and other stakeholders to really drive some of that alignment at a leadership level.
So one of the things is, if we go back to my organizational change, I took the opportunity to have conversations at different levels within the org before it was actually rolled out. So I was looking at this as an opportunity to have some buy-in and gain some partnership as we take this next step. The next thing is within my organization, I also have business partners. So I have people within my team and my org that are specifically focused on how are they going to align with their business partners, whether it's pharma, med, our commercial technology business, to make sure, back to exactly what Marco said, you're working yourself backwards from exactly what the business needs so that we're not just pushing something forward that does not make sense for them. So I think having those key business partners, and when I say business partners, these are people that are getting the privilege of focus to work with their business very closely. Something else Marco said is when you're sitting in a room, you might not be able to tell who's the business and who's IT. And this is how tightly aligned you want to have that in making sure that the partnership really can not just work from a tactical and an operational standpoint, but also work from a strategic standpoint.
Excellent. Marco, curious how you apply that at Goldman as well. Is there a way in which that kind of working backward mentality can be used with your leaders and peers to be able to figure out, okay, what are the main things that we're going to focus on here, and how are we going to make sure that across the organization we're really rowing in the same direction?
First of all, we involve, by definition, the business leaders in our working backwards process. We actually create narratives that are reviewed. And it's actually surprising how if you go to a business person and you're asking them to review a PowerPoint, they're never going to do it for you. But if you ask them to be a peer reviewer of a client-centric document that actually explains the customer pain points first, they will jump at that and add actually narratives and add their own experience in dealing with customers, et cetera, et cetera. So they are embedded part of the process. And we also, like Michelle said, we have developed a very strong product management discipline within engineering that has their purpose is really to bridge this gap between non-technical people and the business people and then the technical people. And they are the stewards of the roadmaps and the stewards of the service level expectations. They're the stewards of the customer experience. And those are actually something that we can measure. We can measure in terms of customer satisfaction. We can measure in terms of adoption. We can measure in terms of retention. And the trick is to measure technology with business KPIs, because at the end of the day, it's all about outcomes. Then nobody cares if your latency has gone down 3% or STP ratio is going up to 98.9%. What they love is, hey, we were able to actually capture this class of customers which had that requirements because we actually made the service better. So you always bring it back to something that is directly related to that. And then another pretty phenomenal tool for us has been the way we completely changed our budgeting process. It used to be classic. CIO goes in front of someone and goes like, hey, last year I had 4 and this year I want 4.5. Okay, here's 4.3. We actually now do a zero-based budget. So we start from zero entitlement. So we actually restart from zero every year. And we rebuild it up initiative by initiative from the ground up, and then we prioritize it into categories, and then we kind of link it to, okay, this is for example, new initiatives that are actually linked to this particular business growth areas, and these are catering, for example, to regulatory requirements, etc. And then we prioritize that, and that process is done together with the business leadership because they will actually input what the business priorities are. And when you start from zero, you're forcing yourself to stack rank, and obviously you stack rank based on your strategy. And if you can't, that means you don't have a strategy. At that point, you're forced to do one. And that has been, this year we took almost 3 months going through that process, and with hundreds of iterations, we reviewed with the leadership like in excess of 2,500 individual programs. And I think that was a really absolute game changer for us.
Great. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's super interesting. And there is something about starting back with zero that really forces you to take that blank slate approach and see where maybe there are some potholes that you might be heading toward. Another thing that's come up a lot over the course of this conversation and throughout the conference today has been really just the flexibility of talent and the ways in which a lot of organizations are reskilling and upskilling folks across their teams, but also seeing people move from one part of the organization to another part of the organization. And it's almost like that enterprise mindset in practice and really starting to see what happens when the organization becomes more permeable. Michelle, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about how you're thinking about that at Cardinal and how some of this enterprise thinking starts to apply to your broader talent strategy, both sort of within IT, but beyond that as well.
Number one, I love this conversation. I love this topic because talent, of course, without our talent, then we have nothing. So it is about making sure that you get recruiting the right people, continuing to re-recruit. We also do stay interviews. So not just wanting to do interviews and exit interviews when people leave, but understand why are people continuing to stay and what's keeping them energized. But when you think about this enterprise mindset and our talent, we have found that our talent appreciates when they're given opportunities for stretch assignments, things that maybe are not in their particular silo or their wheelhouse, or things that they haven't done before. I continue to encourage the team that many times people see things in you that you don't see in yourself. So when someone asks you about an opportunity, have the conversation as to why were you the person that they reached out to or that they selected for this opportunity. Well, I'll give you an example. We formed an SAP COE. Prior to that, we had our SAP talent spread out all over the org. Well, what you found is that was kind of boxing people in into the segment they supported or the function that they supported. Now having the COE, they have an opportunity to move around and work on all things that are SAP. And we've seen energy levels go up. We've seen excitement around this structure. So I would just say that you have to be careful. I think as leaders sometimes, unintentionally, you may box people in a space where they work, but I think it's important to have people that you can stretch and move and sometimes give them a little nudge into doing something that's outside of their comfort zone.
Michelle, sticking with you briefly, I'm curious how this also applies to a kind of recruitment strategy. As you're looking out at new talent across the organization, how are you identifying those people to bring into IT or thinking about other parts of the organization from a recruiting standpoint?
So what I appreciate is the tight alignment we also have. So outside of just the direct business, I have an extremely close relationship with my HR business partners. So making sure that they understand where are there other opportunities. I've encouraged my team when we do succession planning, give me at least a couple of people on your succession plan that are not within IT. So now you spread it out and given some of the responsibility of looking for talent to some of your leaders and even people below. So if you think about building succession plans, manager and up, then if we can have at least one or two people sprinkled here and there that are not within IT, then that's also about your diversity and inclusion strategy as well.
Marco, curious how when you're going through a hiring process or you're thinking about training a new leader, moving someone into a new position, how do you start to identify the change agents, or how do you screen for people who have that enterprise mindset or the potential to develop it? Are there any sorts of behaviors or characteristics that you've seen that are really representative of this?
It's kind of a multi-layered approach. One thing I actually liked what Michelle said about succession planning, and we went to the extent of even having in the succession planning, people indicate not only colleagues outside their own organization, but even external people outside the company. So actually identify talent in the industry that could be in the succession plan so that you're aware of others that are actually kind of done something interesting outside Goldman Sachs. In the interview process, when we talk about this cultural shift and this mindset shift from pure IT to more like, you have this new engineer 2.0, which is as aware of business as they are aware of technology, we crystallize that into a set of engineering tenets. So those are like prescriptive in a way, ways we look at the world it's a list of 9 tenets, which are, for example, build with purpose, which is essentially understanding the why, or obsessing over the user experience, or looking around corners, or innovating incrementally. So they're really like trying to crystallize what are the behavioral characteristics of people, because by the way, it's a little bit about knowledge, of course, but a lot is about behavior. Behavior is actually somehow more important than knowledge, because you can have all the knowledge in the world, but you might not apply it at the right time. And so we do behavioral, and we do like a SMART type of interviews, which is the situational behavioral type of interviews, where we try to embed those tenets into situational questions, and we ask leaders to describe a situation where, for example, you had to arbitrate between a customer commitment and a newly discovered issue that would stretch the timeline. So like this kind of always pulling into two directions and see how people have actually behaved in those cases. Always putting the customer at the center. And then I always like to ask the question, what's the project that you're most proud of? That's a super telling, because if it is proud because you solved a big problem, you maybe get passing grades. But if you're proud because of your ego, you definitely don't pass the grades. If you're happy because you actually made customers or clients happy and you solved the customer problem, then you get, like A+. And then the next question is always like, when they're all excited about that, I ask, okay, what is your biggest professional failure? And I tell you that just the way they approach the answer, it tells you a lot, because you have people that are like faking the answer, like, oh, my biggest professional failure was not to believe in my capabilities enough, that kind of stuff, like whatever. And others that are just basically scratching their head and say, where do I start? Because everybody will live in customer, in a customer world where, I always say, life is like a P&L. You have the stuff that you've done right, it's your revenue. The stuff that you've done wrong is your cost. And as long as you have positive EBITDA, like you have 30% or so, you're in good shape. But if you have negative EBITDA, maybe you can, you're a little bit in trouble. But if you have a 90% or 100% EBITDA, then maybe you're actually not really looking at your books in the right way. And so really looking at the balance between success and failure is a huge indicator for us of people that are really customer-centric, because issues will happen. And the first thing that builds trust with customers is to be able to fully recognize something that you've done wrong and something that you can change. And we even embed that in the working backwards process in a section that we call like the harsh FAQ, where we ask ourselves the harshest questions that a customer could ask. So that's kind of really why it's really deeply cultural. At the end of the day, it's not about technology too much. It's about actually like the way you really approach the world in a different way with all the knowledge that you have accumulated in actually building stuff for your customers and solving real problems.
Yes, indeed. Well, thanks, Marco. I'm going to have to go and take a look at my personal P&L after this and report back to you. Michelle, Marco, the last question that I have for each of you in the few minutes that we have is just, would love to hear any sort of tips that you have for the folks in the audience that they might take into their own organizations. Obviously, an enterprise mindset involves a lot of behaviors, a lot of different actions over time, but are there any kind of tips or things that you feel are particularly salient when thinking about driving this mindset that you'd like to share with the group? Michelle, maybe we can start with you.
I would say, first of all, we need to have the do-say ratio, do what we say that we will do. And also just being mindful that if people enjoy working with you, then they'll enjoy working for you. So just making sure that your team understands that you have their back. And when you're asking them to do something, you're clear and able to articulate the reason that you're asking and the outcome that we hope to achieve. I've just found that being extremely effective in your communication methods with your teams yields great results.
Excellent. And Marco, over to you.
I think in the complexity of the business that we live in today, it almost forces you to take dependencies on each other, right? You can't really try to build everything yourself in a silos. And so when you're thinking about this heavily interconnected organization, at the end of the day, the thing that actually matters the most is trust. And in order to actually build trust, because you're actually taking dependencies on others for your goals, I think my tip is the biggest currency for trust is transparency. So we over-index on transparency. When we say transparency is, transparency of roadmaps. We do 2x2s of like hundreds of products where we actually do a sort of this is what went right, this is what went wrong, and this, the deadlines that we missed, the same way as the deadlines that we achieved. These are our service level expectations. This is how we miss them. This is how we're actually meeting them. So we kind of give business people in their own language a tool to read through the organization and understand if we're actually going in the right direction or not. And I think the building of trust is really the currency that brings those two teams together, because at the end of the day, that's also what resonates on the customers.
Excellent insight. We will wrap up for today. Michelle, Marco, thank you so much for such an engaging conversation. I've learned a ton. I have no doubt that the audience has as well. Thank you so much for taking the time, and I will look forward to catching up again soon.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for having me.